Head of Energy Systems Analysis at the Andlinger Centre for Energy and Environment at Princeton University, where he's been on the faculty for 36 years.
33.
So,
33.
33 years, sorry, I took 3 years off you. And he's also a senior scientist with a group called Climate Central, which is headquartered in Princeton, but whose role is kind of the science communication of complex issues around climate change and energy systems. I'm not going to say any more because everyone who's accepted this invite saw Eric's CV or bio on the website. Today he's going to talk about deep decarbonisation and the role of bioenergy with CCS and other negative emissions options. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eric, and he'll talk for around 40 minutes or so, then we'll have 15 minutes of questions, and we have some drinks and refreshments afterwards.
Great. Thank you. Is that projecting? Yeah? Thank you, Chris, and thank you for everyone turning up on the Christmas holiday, which is hard for me to think of as Christmas holiday coming from New Jersey, where it's quite cold, and that's what I expect at Christmas time, but it's a different experience here. So the Paris Climate Agreement, which all of you are probably familiar with, calls for, if it's not canceled by our next president in the United States, calls for a 2-degree limit on global warming, and maybe even 1.5 degrees, and to achieve that, it's going to require deep decarbonization, and I'll talk more about what that means quantitatively. And we're already warming at about 1 degree centigrade over the pre-industrial period, and it's leading to things like the Great Barrier Reef bleaching and other consequences, which will only get worse as the warming increases beyond 2 degrees. 2 degrees is not a hard and fast number where things start happening. Things are already happening, and they're going to get worse as we continue to warm. But the 2 degrees sort of sets a climate mitigation challenge that we have as a global community. And what I want to talk about today is quantifying that challenge, putting some numbers to it in a way that I think will be relatable. What are pathways for greenhouse gas emissions in the future that can keep us below that 2 degrees C warming, according to the models that we are relying on today? What role does negative emissions, that is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, play in those models? And how does that compare with the reality of concepts for negative emissions today, especially bioenergy with carbon capture and storage? And then what do we need going forward? So I'm going to start with kind of a complex-looking graph, but it's got a simple message. And so this shows on the y-axis the warming since the pre-industrial time. And on the x-axis is the amount of CO2 that we've emitted cumulatively from fossil fuel combustion, basically, since that time period. And the various colored ovals are the projections of different climate models as to what the warming will be as a function of this cumulative emissions. And different models that involve different amounts of emissions get you to different concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, which correspond to certain levels of warming. And the basic message here is that the level of warming increases with the cumulative amount of CO2 that we emit. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty that you can see around that, but basically it's a straight line relationship. So we know if we're going to go for 2 degrees, we know how much CO2 we can emit cumulatively, basically forever, from the time frames that we care about, 100-year, 200-year kind of time frames. That defines the challenge for 2 degrees. And the budget that we have left, what's called the CO2 budget, this is how much more CO2 we can emit before we hit that 2 degree C limit. So somewhere between 600 and 1,200, which looks like a large uncertainty range, but in fact, compared to put that in some perspective, we're emitting about 40 gigatons of CO2 per year today, and we have 600 left that we can emit at the low end, 1,200 at the high end. And just for comparison, fossil fuel reserves that we know are in the ground and we know we can get them out are 4,000 to 7,000 gigatons. So we're not going to be able to use all of that fossil fuel and stay under the CO2 limit unless we find a way of taking CO2 out of the energy system. So I'll come back to this 600 to 1,200 number a little bit later in the talk, but just keep in mind that's sort of our budget that we have left to spend on emissions. This is a kind of a complicated looking graph. I call it the spaghetti diagram. But this is basically shows various trajectories for emissions of CO2 that we could follow going forward from, these were developed starting in 2010. And depending on the level of temperature that we want to get to, you can follow one of these various trajectories. So the red line, for example, these are called RCPs, which is a jargon that's used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We don't really need to understand exactly what that means, but it corresponds to a warming temperature range, 3 to 5 degrees C for the red line. The blue line is the one that can get us to 2 degrees C, and then there are intermediate ones. And again, because it's the cumulative amount of emissions that matter, you can follow different trajectories and get basically to the same warming level. So different models, these are the results of what's called integrated assessment models, which take into account how energy is used in the economy as a function of what energy costs. And energy costs include the cost of carbon emissions, so a carbon tax, for example. And these various model results tell you that in order to get to 2 degrees C, we go starting around 2070 here, we hit a net negative emissions, all right? And that's the trajectory that by the time we get to 2100, we will have used up our 2 degree C budget of somewhere between 600 and 1,200 gigatons emissions. The other important thing to note here is that these scenarios were developed starting in 2010, and the current trajectory is the black line here, and we're sort of following the highest level here. All right? So that's we're already diverging from this pathway that was considered to be the one that would let us stay below 2 degrees C. And the negative emissions that come here are typically assumed by the models to be bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That's the technology that the models have embedded in them, and it's one of the few ways that you can take CO2 out of the atmosphere in the modeling system. And in fact, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, states that most of the models could not reach stay below 2 degrees C warming if you don't have bioenergy and if you don't have CCS included in them. And in other cases, the models, it becomes much more expensive to do it without these technologies. And just so we're all on the same page about what bioenergy with carbon capture and storage means, this is a cartoon depiction of the carbon flows for a biomass energy system with CCS. As you grow biomass, you take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis. Some of that will be stored in the soil. The rest of it goes as your energy feedstock into some conversion process. Here I've shown electricity production, and you have some emissions to the atmosphere, but you capture a lot of the CO2 that's produced in the combustion of the biomass and put that in storage below ground. That's the CCS part. And so the net emissions to the atmosphere, if you sum up the negative emissions here and the positive emissions here, you'll come out with overall negative emissions. So your electricity is being generated with negative emissions. You can also do this and make liquid fuels in a similar way. Some of the carbon now goes back to the atmosphere through the combustion of the fuel, but you can still get a net negative emission system if you if you do carbon capture and storage. And then finally, some work we've done in the past, but I won't dwell on it, but you could actually combine fossil fuels with biomass to make electricity or make liquid fuels with carbon capture and storage, and you could still get negative emissions or neutral energy systems. So that's what BECCS means, and in the context that I'm going to talk about today mostly is electricity generation from biomass only. So this is a simplified version of that spaghetti diagram that I showed you, and this black line here represents the trajectory that I showed you with the blue line in the previous graph, and you can see it goes negative, net negative emissions around 2070. This is a diagram I've taken from a science article just came out a couple of months ago. I think it's a really informative way to talk about bioenergy with CCS. And this pink upper line here is the positive emissions that are assumed in this particular model. These are the negative emissions that are assumed in the model. So you take this minus this, and you get the black line, the net emissions. So globally, net emissions don't go below zero until 2070, but in fact, in this model, by 2030 or so, you're starting to require negative emissions. All right. And the reliance, this is bioenergy with CCS basically, and the reliance on this is quite strong. So by mid-century, we're using somewhere between 100 and 200 exajoules of bioenergy. And just to put that number in perspective, total energy use worldwide today is about 500 exajoules. So it's a very significant amount of biomass energy that's being used, and most of it is being, or much of it is being used with CCS. So it's quite quite an industry that has to develop in order to meet this kind of emissions trajectory. So the three main points that are shown on this graph here are that we need a large amount of cumulative negative emissions in order to stay within the 2-degree target. The negative emissions don't start in 2070. They start much earlier in these models. And the other point is that if we look at where actual emissions have gone, this scenario was developed, as I mentioned, starting in around 2010, when a lot of the scenario analysis was done. And since 2010, we've actually continued to grow our emissions globally. That's the gray area here. And what's called the INDCs, the intended nationally determined emissions contributions to emissions globally. These are the commitments, voluntary commitments that were made as part of the Paris Agreement by each country. They would have us, as a world, the emissions would be going on this kind of a trajectory, so that by 2030 we'd be up here rather than here, and that makes the job that much more difficult to achieve. So why do these models like the BECCS technology so much? I mean, they think that BECCS is going to be available and cost-effective starting in 2030. And so the way the models work is they find the least cost way of achieving the overall goal, which is over a 100-year period, basically, to keep warming below a certain target, say 2 degrees. And the way they do that is to assume a carbon price. They ratchet up the carbon price until the energy consumption within the economy goes down to the point where you can stay below the target that you're after, 2 degrees or 3 degrees or 4 degrees. And for a 2-degree scenario, the carbon price that's required by 2030 is in the ballpark of $100 a ton of CO2. By 2050, it's $200 a ton of CO2. And just to illustrate why the models like BECCS so much with those kinds of carbon prices, I'm going to show you a couple of lines on a graph like this, which is the cost of generating electricity with different technologies as a function of the carbon price. And here I've shown what an existing coal-fired power plant, these are sort of US conditions. You can see a coal-fired power plant might be $40 to $50 per megawatt hour to generate electricity, but as you increase the carbon price, you're paying for the emissions from the coal plant, and so it goes up quite sharply. Natural gas is an alternative in the US that's become quite popular, and it doesn't go up quite as steeply because the carbon emissions per unit of electricity generated is lower. If you add now CCS to this to these systems, the black line is a coal-fired power plant with CCS added to it. You can see that when you get to about $80 a ton of CO2, then it becomes more cost-effective to use the CCS option. And with natural gas, the crossover point is a little bit further out, so somewhere in the ballpark of $100 a ton of CO2. But in all four cases, the lines are sloping up because you're still emitting some CO2 as you generate electricity. With BECCS, the line goes the other direction because we're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. We're effectively being paid for the CO2 that we take out of the atmosphere. And so the economics become very favorable when you get up to the ballpark of $80 to $100 a ton of CO2. And this is the basic reason that the models like BECCS and choose it when you get these high carbon prices. So how much BECCS do these is really assumed here. I want to put this number in a little bit of perspective. What does that mean? How much are these models asking for? Well, I've translated those negative emissions into equivalent electricity generation capacity in gigawatts, and also the number of plants that would be built each year, assuming that a typical plant uses 1 million tons per year of biomass, which is a fairly large scale for a biomass plant, but plausible, makes 170 megawatts of electricity, captures 90% of the carbon, which is technically doable, and operates for 30 years. So in the first 20 years, from 2030 to 2050, under that scenario that I showed you, you'd have to build 220 plants a year at this scale, which is about 38 gigawatts per year. And it drops off a little bit, and then it picks up again as you have to replace plants that are retired from the ones that you started with. And just to put these numbers in some perspective, this is the rate at which we've built coal plants in the last 2007 to 2013. 67 gigawatts per year of coal plants were built, and that's, so that number compares with 38 gigawatts. Doesn't seem completely implausible. And PV and wind systems were built at comparable rates. So it seems that it might be plausible that you could build that technology that rapidly. But this is just the above ground part of the system that's generating the electricity. You have a whole below ground system for storing the carbon, which would also have to be developed. And this gives you some idea of what would be required there. The y-axis here is the volume of CO2 that you would be putting below ground compared to the volume of oil that we're taking out of the ground globally today. So this says that starting in 2030, by 2042, 12 years' time, you have an industry storing CO2 in volumes that's the size of today's oil industry. So you're growing a whole new industry equivalent to today's global oil industry in 10 years, putting away CO2, which seems a little bit but the models assume that can be done. So the other point that I will come back to is this line here assumes that we aren't going up this line here, right? If in fact we continue to emit following the commitments that countries have made, essentially voluntary commitments, so there's no guarantee, but let's say that we manage to go to 2030 and peak our global emissions at that point, then we have a much sharper reduction in emissions and a much higher rate of negative emissions. And if you, I just did a quick calculation of the actual numbers, and you basically double the amount of negative emissions of BECS that you would need if you delay that peak, if you don't start reducing until 2030. So we're basically digging ourselves deeper into a hole by continuing where we're going now. And there's a fellow named Will Rogers, who's an American humorist, who said that when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging, right? And so stop digging in this case means we need to make efforts to basically get down emissions down through means other than CCS at first, through efficiency, through low carbon energy sources. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that at some point we are going to need negative emissions. In order for the climate to stay stable, you have to have no net emissions to the atmosphere. So there are some places where it's going to be very difficult to eliminate emissions. For example, in agriculture, nitrogen fertilizers result in some emissions of N2O, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. It's going to be hard to get by feeding 10 billion people in the future without fertilization in agriculture. And so to offset those emissions, you'll need some negative emissions. And so it's going to be important one way or another to have CCS, bioenergy with CCS, or other ways of achieving negative emissions. But perhaps we can buy ourselves some time to develop that technology more slowly than the models think we need it. The BECS system has basically three new industries that we're developing. There's a biomass supply industry. There's a bioenergy conversion system industry, and then there's a CO2 storage industry. And each one of those has to be developed for this technology to be ready. Biomass is a complicated energy source. I won't go into details on these issues, but it's a land use competition issue is an important one. Biomass needs water to grow. Soil needs to maintain productivity through nutrients being revitalized, and there are a bunch of other issues that go along with bioenergy. Proper accounting of the greenhouse gases. If you go and cut down a tropical rainforest and use it for energy, that's not a positive greenhouse gas impact. But there are sources of biomass that one can envision using sustainably, but it has to be done thoughtfully and with careful attention to what the ecosystem impacts are. So that's on the biomass supply industry development. The technologies themselves to convert the biomass into electricity or fuels. This is a generic sort of graph that's called the mountain of death. When you develop new technologies, the capital cost per unit of capacity of a technology, typically when you first get an idea, it looks too good to be true, but you keep working on it, and the costs keep going up until you build that first plant. And Chris is very familiar with this idea that it becomes quite expensive, but over time you learn how to do it, build it better, and the costs come down, and eventually you get to a point where hopefully it's a cost-competitive technology. But getting over this mountain of death has been the end of many technologies historically, particularly large-scale infrastructure systems like advanced energy systems. And there's one example that we're living with in the U.S. that not to beat this to death, but this is a coal-fired power plant that is doing CCS, carbon capture, and the initial estimates were that it was going to cost $2 billion for this plant, and by the time it just started operation this past month, it's more than tripled in cost. And there are examples like this throughout the literature where costs keep going up unexpectedly. And the question is, will the cost come down after we learn a little bit about how to do these systems, will the cost come down to the level that the models think that it will come down to, and that the models require for it to be the technology of choice, for BECCS to be the technology of choice. And that's an open question. We don't know what the shape of this curve is here, and we have to figure out a way to pay for this, for the higher costs, higher than competitive costs initially. In the case of this project in Mississippi, the shareholders of the company paid for most of the extra costs here, but that's not likely to happen again, at least not with this company. Then on the underground side of CCS development, there's actually a fair number of projects where carbon capture is being done and carbon storage is going on, but most of those projects are for use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, EOR, which is a way of storing carbon and a way of, as a result, you get increased oil production from old oil fields. And you can see these are, as far as I could get from a scan of the literature, these are the actual CCS projects in operation, and you can see most of them are EOR associated. But the largest capacity for taking CO2, which we will need if we're going to do it in the volumes that I showed you with BECCS systems, will require storage in geologic formations that are not old oil fields. They're called saline aquifers, deep underground formations, and we don't have very much experience either doing that technically or in regulating it so that we make sure that the CO2 stays down. So there's quite a bit of development that needs to be done on the CCS side as well. So there's a lot of challenges to achieving this BECCS goal that the models think we should be going after. So one question that comes up is, can we meet that goal without negative emissions? And I wanted to show you just some back of the envelope calculations for that, to answer that question. So this shows the relative carbon intensity of the primary energy that's used in the United States. So the intensity is the amount of carbon per unit of energy that we use. And you can see historically there hasn't been much incentive to decrease carbon intensity. We see the drop-off here in the last decade or so, and that's due to the shift from coal to natural gas as a result of shale gas revolution in the U.S. But it's still not a huge drop, but it's dropping somewhat. The biggest, as far as I know, the biggest reduction in carbon intensity came in France in the 1970s and 1980s as a reaction to the oil price shocks of the 1970s. They created a nuclear power program that ramped up nuclear capacity very rapidly, and I think this stretch in here is about the fastest that any region has decarbonized its energy system. And that's France, which is a population of what, 50 million, Max? Is that about right? Max is from France. So in the scenarios that that I've showed you on the 2 degrees C, this is sort of the rate at which we would need to decarbonize the global energy system, not just a 50 million population, but a 10 billion population. And these are the assumptions here: 10 billion people by 2050. We continue to grow income at a sort of historical average rate globally, and we improve our efficiency. We double the rate at which we improve our efficiency of producing $1 of goods. We need the energy used to produce $1 of goods. And with those assumptions, this is how fast you would have to decarbonize the primary energy system in order to stay within the CO2 budget and not use negative emissions. But as you can see, eventually we're going to hit zero here, and we will have to use negative emissions at that point. So France managed to do it at somewhat similar rate, but globally we have to do it faster, and we have to maintain it over a 40-year period. So it's at least a 40-year period. So it's quite a challenge to to do it without negative emissions. But BECCS is not the only way to get negative emissions. And this is a menu of the negative emission options. Biological ones, which depend on land, basically. Growing biomass, BECCS is the first one. They're soils. You can store carbon in soils and or use the above ground biomass for energy at the same time. And of course you can plant trees with afforestation or reforestation, and the carbon will be absorbed by the trees until they reach mature size, and then it'll stop at that point. There are chemical ways to do it. Direct air capture is basically taking CO2 through chemical filters, taking air through chemical filters that extract the CO2, and then storing that CO2 below ground. There are other ways to do it that involve the ocean and accelerated weathering or mineralization of CO2. The biological systems are generally considered to be more feasible in the near term and probably less expensive. But there's work going on all of these at some level. One that we're particularly interested in at Princeton right now is the idea of using very degraded land that's not suitable for agriculture, and there's a lot of that around the world. If you're able to establish plant material on the land, it can help restore the soil productivity while also storing carbon. And we're working with some colleagues at the University of Minnesota who have trial plots where they've been measuring on the order of 3 to 4 tons per hectare per year of CO2 equivalent carbon storage using native species on degraded lands. And if you extrapolate that to the global availability of abandoned land, you get 1 to 2 gigatons a year of CO2 storage in soils. So again, our current emissions are about 40. 1 to 2 doesn't seem like a lot, but as we get our emissions down, that becomes an important number. So overall, there are a variety of ways that land-based mitigation is possible, and there's this nice paper that Keith Paustian did recently that estimated somewhere on the order of 8 gigatons a year might be sustainable for reduction of emissions. And these are various, I won't go into the details, but restoring degraded lands. There's biochar, some of you may be familiar with. There are various cropland management systems, for example, no-till cropping instead of tilled cropping, and so on. So there are ways we can do this to get negative emissions other than BECCS, but BECCS nonetheless is an important one. So just to sort of wrap up here and recall a few key points that I made, the remaining carbon budget for 2 degrees C is on the order of 600 to 1,200 gigatons of CO2. And we're going to need negative emissions sooner or later. If we don't need them sooner, we'll need them later in order to offset unavoidable positive emissions. And the models that deploy the BECCS widely and cost effectively is because they make assumptions about both the availability of the technologies and the costs of these things. And the question is whether we can achieve those levels of availability and cost that the models assume. And it looks pretty challenging from some of the numbers that I showed you. And without aggressive development, technology R&D, and development of regulatory systems and institutions that can regulate the development of the sort of these three industries that have to go together: biomass supply, biomass conversion, and CO2 storage. It's going to be very difficult for BECCS to be ready by 2030. So going forward, first thing to do is to stop digging. That is, really push hard for energy efficiency and low carbon energy sources to the extent that we can. But then keep in mind that there are these challenges to developing a whole new industry like BECCS, and we will need not only public support but private support. So partnerships that can help develop the research and demonstration projects and eventually deploy commercially. There's an example of this that was created at the Paris conference, Mission Innovation and the Breakthrough Energy Coalition. Mission Innovation, it was sort of a pact between governments and the private sector. Mission Innovation is a government, on the order of 20 governments, I believe, committed to doubling their research and development budget for clean energy. At the same time, the Breakthrough Energy Coalition is a Bill Gates led activity of a bunch of billionaires, basically, who committed to help fund the more expensive steps of taking the technology from the lab to commercial applications. And it's across all types of technologies, but BECS is one that could certainly benefit from that kind of partnership. It's going to be important to share knowledge internationally on technology because the requirements to develop these technologies are, the cost to develop the technologies are quite significant, and so it's important to derive as much learning as we can across countries and across institutions. It's important, I think, also to work on negative emissions other than BECS, in addition to BECS, especially the land-based options, because those are some of the things that we know how to do today, and they're relatively inexpensive, but it's not something you can do overnight, and you need to develop the knowledge and monitoring to make sure that we maintain the negative emissions we might achieve. And then finally, probably most importantly, is that there has to be carbon policies in place that incentivize the sustainable implementation of negative emissions or mitigation more generally. And that basically translates into a carbon price. And as I discussed earlier, the IPCC thinks that we need somewhere on the order of $100 a ton globally by 2030 and maybe $200 a ton by 2050. So there's a lot of things that have to happen. I think BECS is not going to be the silver bullet that solves the climate problem. It's one of technologies that could be in the toolbox in the long term, and it should continue to receive attention. But I think in the meantime, we need to also be working hard to reduce emissions through other means. So that was a pretty quick run through of the slides, but I hope it was informative, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
I wonder, could you give us some idea of the land areas you would need to dedicate to bioenergy production to meet the sort of projections you had for BECS, and maybe give us a sense of what proportion of the world's agricultural land that would represent?
Yeah, so the idea would be not to use agricultural land. And so the IPCC estimates that at a minimum you could get 100 exajoules of biomass without using agricultural land. So you're using things like crop residues, sustainable forestry, harvesting residues, degraded lands of the type that I mentioned. There are 450 million hectares of that kind of land available that's not suitable for agriculture. Those would be where you'd want to start. In the longer term, it's unlikely, I think, that we'd be able to use prime agricultural land and feed the world's population unless we're able to increase agricultural productivities much more in places like Africa and South America. So I can't give you I won't answer the question directly, but the idea is to avoid using good agricultural land.
Brett?
You talk about using basically non-agricultural viable lands for essentially getting your bioenergy. What impact does this have on the costs when you consider that most non-useful or non-agricultural standard levels of land are likely to be in isolated areas or far from places where high energy demands are actually consumed?
Well, in the U.S., that's actually not true. That a lot of the cropland has been overcropped and has become abandoned, essentially. A lot of that is in the Midwest, which is our farm belt. The costs are, yeah, you'd rather grow biomass on good quality land in terms of yields and costs, but that's where you need to have a carbon price that incentivizes a lower yield biomass, but at the same time regulations that don't lead to people just planting bioenergy on good crop land. So that's what I mean by it's a complicated energy source. But we've done some analysis of, for example, corn stover, which is in the U.S. that's a big crop, corn, and you can make the economics work if you're collecting it from pretty dispersed area, but with a sufficient carbon price, you can make the economics of this kind of thing work.
And just quickly, second question there. You showed some some assumptions that showed the rate of deployment of BECCS technologies in order to hit the negative emissions. And you said you showed some coal deployments that are similar or higher rates. Historically speaking, though, have any energy technologies, as an emerging technology, emerged at the rate that we would need them, as shown in your models?
Well, so the nuclear example in France is probably pretty close to that.
Close to the deployment rate that you said we would need for BECCS coming online in 2030?
Yeah, I haven't done that comparison directly, but I don't know the exact, but I'm guessing that the rate at which nuclear came online early on was probably, but the important thing to point out there is a nuclear plant is sort of 1,000 gigawatts at a shot, whereas these are 200, so you're at most, or 170, so you're having to build a lot more plants, which on the one hand you might be learning more as you go from one to the next, but it's going to take you longer to get the same build rate. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question while we're waiting. Just put in another sort of, again, scale issue. I added up all those CCS projects that you had, and I think I got to 20 million tonnes a year. But I think your other graph says we've got to get to something like 10,000 million tonnes a year. Yeah. So that's a factor of 500 scale up. Right. And then we've got to get to 200 exajoules of bioenergy. How many exajoules of bioenergy are we using now?
So we use virtually none, except for in traditional ways of 50 exajoules, something like that in traditional ways. So right. Developing countries.
So it seems like we've got to go up by two or three orders of magnitude in 30 years on two things combined that we currently can't do very well.
Right.
Yeah. Looks hard.
Yeah.
Is there someone with a... Oh, yeah. Paul.
I'm familiar with the situation in Western Canada there at Weyburn and using heavy oil reservoirs as a way of capturing as an option. What are the options in Australia? We have no heavy oil production. We have no geologic formations to turn the CO2 into carbonate. So what are the options we've got here in Australia for carbon sequestration?
So I think I should let Chris answer that because I'm not familiar with
So we've got a lot of options for saline storage of CO2. Gippsland Basin, Surat Basin, that's what Gorgon is doing in the Northwest Shelf. But we don't have any enhanced oil recovery opportunities that are of significance. So we're up for relatively expensive storage, rather than these guys who get paid some money to put CO2 in the ground.
You would create more CO2 to take it to Gippsland than you would sequester, would you?
No, so you've got brown coal power stations in the Gippsland, or in Victoria now, so you could capture CO2 from them and inject it into storage formations there.
But just to be clear, you said it would be more expensive, but I think the capture part is the
part's the much more expensive part.
The storage part is once we figure out an industry for doing it, it shouldn't be too expensive.
Should be less expensive, yeah. yeah.
Has there been any consideration of how sensitive the technology will be to changes like in soil productivity with climate change? Because like I've seen some projections like for the US where there's sort of general drying trends that actually look quite severe towards the end of the century. So I'm just wondering, like, you know, given that you need biomass as the fuel source, but particularly if you sort of overshoot and you look for BECCS to sort of pull things back in, you know, like it could be that a lot of the sort of arable land now may not be there in the future, and that might potentially be a constraint. And the second question is, in terms of how much carbon has to be sequestered underground, has there been any assessment sort of like, you know, basically, you know, can the underground storages meet the requirements? And, you know, like, given that it has to be stored for a reasonably long time, potentially year on year at sort of 10, 20, 30 gigatons worth of storage year on year for a significant long period of time. So I was just wondering if there's been any assessment about like just the ability for the underground, you know, geological storages to handle that quantity.
Yeah, those are both great questions. I don't know specifically of work that's been done looking at the impact of climate change on the sort of where you would be able to grow biomass for energy. I know there have been a number of studies of looking at the impact on agriculture, which is effectively this, you know, similar sort of analysis, and there may have been some analysis done for that. I know that in some places things will improve. For example, in Canada, I think might be better for growing things, but there are many places where it won't be. Yeah, but I can't answer the question directly. As far as the CO2 storage capacity of the underground space around the world, there have been estimates, pretty extensive estimates made of that, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it's a substantial capacity for taking CO2. I think the bigger question, and I'll let Chris answer, add to whatever I might say, but the bigger question is at what rate can you inject it? There may be storage capacity, but you can't inject it beyond a certain rate without risking cracking of the rocks that would seal the storage, for example. And there's been less work done on understanding that on a sort of a basin by basin basis. So you have an estimate for capacity, but you don't know how fast you can fill that capacity, which is important when you're injecting. Right? I don't know if you want
the big question is at what cost? At what cost per tonne? So in Australia, I think we can store all the CO2 we would want to store, but can we do it all at a reasonable cost? That's the question. There's some places where it's likely to be reasonable cost, others where it's not. And then you go to a place like India, which is, you know, high CO2 emissions, doesn't look very promising at all. So the issue is about where the CO2 sources are, where the sinks are, and then at what cost will they take CO2. Right up the back there.
A lot of work over the years in terms of biomass co-firing of existing coal-fired power stations, and we really struggle with economic transport distances. So we just could not get enough supply within even a 350, 400k radius. And looking at all different logistics systems of railways or roads, and, you know, moving millions of tonnes of materials in BAB quad trucks past primary schools and all kinds of problems like that. Have you seen anywhere in, say, developed countries where they've actually come up with more advanced logistics systems to handle the kind of quantities of biomass that we're talking about? Because you can get people to grow it if you pay them enough, right. But moving the quantities was one of the really big struggles that we had. And we're used to moving millions of tonnes of coal around, but we just couldn't seem to come up with an acceptable solution for moving biomass, which is planted all over the countryside, literally.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a big problem with biomass. We've done some analysis ourselves of trying to supply 1 million tons a year, and we found that the economics continue to improve the larger you make your facility because of the scale economies of the conversion plant, but the number of trucks you would have to take through just becomes prohibitive. You know, you're bringing a truck in every 10 seconds or something to unload, and that's just not practical. So you get traffic congestion is what's going to limit you, not the economics per se. I know that one of the DOE, Department of Energy National Labs in the U.S. has been working on specifically, and maybe you're familiar with this, specifically with systems for providing delivery of biomass in more cost-effective ways without that congestion problem. I don't remember the name of the specific. It involves a mulching and a compression process at the front end before you put it onto some sort of flat rail cars or that sort of thing. So, but it's I mean, that's one of the limitations of bioenergy is you're limited to smaller facilities.
And there's another question towards the back there. Go ahead.
Thanks for the good talk. With the imminent change in leadership that we are going to see happening in the US and in some other parts of Europe, what kind of support in terms of developing new technologies do you expect to get from the government, especially when some of them are saying that Paris Climate Agreement might not be valid and that kind of stuff?
I would first take issue with the word leadership. Yeah, you guys have all seen the reports that come out as well as I have, and it's completely unpredictable. Completely unpredictable. I mean, the positive outlook is that because he's unpredictable, that's good, even though he said that he's going to cancel Paris. On the other hand, he's appointing somebody to organize the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the agency in the U.S. that is the one that is able to regulate carbon, who's a climate denier. So it's not the scenario I would have liked to have seen for climate.
Martin, you got a mic behind you, Martin.
Thanks, a very interesting presentation. Just wondering, I guess the consideration of some low-hanging fruit. Things like municipal solid waste is collected. Western societies tend to be very good at the amount of municipal solid waste that they generate. Have you looked at what percentage of perhaps initial bio-CCS might come from something like municipal solid waste, particularly in, say, a society like the United States, like Australia, like Western Europe?
I haven't looked at those numbers specifically for CCS. We did some work quite a while ago now looking at New York City's garbage, municipal solid waste, and using that for energy purposes, but not in the context of CCS. And there's a lot of energy there. In the U.S., it's very difficult to get a permit for using municipal solid waste for energy, just because of historical concerns. I don't know what it's like in Australia, if it's similar. I know in Europe it's much more common. The other municipal solid waste is not all biomass, and so there's a less of a carbon impact, but it's probably worth looking at. I mean, I think there you get paid basically paid to take the material, which makes the economics very different.
I guess there's also the fact that I think in a lot of places still municipal solid waste generates methane, which goes up into the atmosphere as well, and if it goes into a facility and potentially gets converted into something that can be converted directly into energy, you may get a bit of an added benefit in that regard.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
very plausible or encouraging talk. My question is that if you have heard that regenerative fuel cells could play a role in the decarbonization process.
Regenerative fuel cells?
Regenerative fuel cells.
I'm not familiar with what a regenerative fuel cell is.
Well, we do an electrolysis of the water, produce hydrogen and oxygen, and that reaction is reversed, can be used to the transport of biomass, for example, of the trucks.
So basically,
free of CO2.
So if I understood, you're electrolyzing water to make hydrogen.
And oxygen.
And oxygen, and then the hydrogen would be used as an energy source? Well,
both of them you can recycle and produce the energy too.
Right. So the electricity for the electrolysis would come from a renewable source. Is that?
Yeah, it could come from solar power.
Right. Yeah. So we've looked at the economics of just making hydrogen by electrolysis using solar, for example. And because the sun only shines a limited number of hours a day, your electrolyzer is not being used very effectively in terms of its capacity, and so the economics are not very favorable for doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the problem with, I think, electrolytic hydrogen and with solar.
Okay, thanks.
So I might make this the last question.
Given, particularly in Australia, in agricultural areas, there has been a fair amount of resistance to taking resources out of the ground, particularly coal seam gas reserves, in terms of water table contamination. I dare say there'd be a similar amount of resistance to putting stuff back into the underground storage reservoirs with similar risks to the water table and so on. Have you got any comments or thoughts on how that potential grassroots resistance can be overcome for these carbon capture options?
Yeah. So that's an important question, and the one point is that the saline aquifers that we're talking about for storage of CO2 are far below drinking water aquifer levels. There's a potential, I guess, that some CO2 could come back up and contaminate the drinking water aquifers. But the more important point, I think, is that the communities that are going to be involved have to be on board with the process. Otherwise, permits won't be given. And the U.S. government has actually done a pretty good job with their CCS program. The Department of Energy they have regional programs to educate people about the technologies and help them understand, so that when somebody proposes a project, there's a level of education that's already there. And that's one of the better things that the government has done over the last decade or so in the U.S. But we're not close to getting projects really going yet, so it hasn't come to the point where there are the inevitable disagreements and fights about doing it. But it's an important issue.
Okay, so we might wrap it up there. And just as a closing note, there was a couple of references made to the next great leader of the United States. Well, tomorrow we've got a talk in the Dow Centre by an author from the US called Robert Bryce, who's basically an energy writer, not a scientist. But it's called COP22, Cop Out, Why Donald Trump, Very Cheap Hydrocarbons and the Insatiable Appetite by India and the Developing World for Fuel means CO2 emissions will continue to rise ever more. So that might be interesting. Look, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Eric. I'd first like to say thank you to Christine and Caroline for organising this on behalf of the Energy Initiative. But it was a great talk. It just every time I listen to one of these talks now, I become more disheartened about the future and whether we're going to ever reduce emissions. But thank you very much. It was very informative. Join us.